Welcome to Have You Read It? The channel where we bring books to life, one summary at a time. Today, we're diving into Mikki Kendall's Feminism. Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. This powerful book challenges mainstream feminist narratives, centering the voices and experiences of marginalized women. Kendall calls for a feminism that addresses basic needs like food security, education and safety, rather than focusing solely on the concerns of the privileged. Hood feminism is valuable because it offers a critical perspective on the intersectionality of feminism, urging us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, class, and privilege within the movement. Let's begin our journey into the main ideas of Hood feminism. Kendall critiques mainstream feminism for centering on the concerns of middle and upper class white women at the expense of other women. She argues that white feminism often fails to show up for women of color, trans women, and other marginalized groups, leading to a one-size-fits-all approach that damages the very people it is supposed to serve. As Kendall puts it, the myth of the strong black woman has made it so that white women can tell themselves that it is okay to expect us to wait to be equal with them, because they need it more. The book challenges the notion that guns aren't a feminist issue. Kendall points out that for many women, especially those from lower-income communities, gun violence is an everyday reality. She emphasizes the increased risk of femicide in domestic violence situations where guns are present, and the impact of gun violence on girls' education and well-being. Kendall connects food insecurity and access to transit, schools, or a living wage to feminism. Recalling her own experience with dependence on food stamps, a state-funded medical card, and public housing. She contends that these struggles are often ignored in mainstream feminist circles. The author elaborates that, as a society, we tend to treat hunger as a moral failing, as a sign that someone is lacking in a fundamental way. Kendall explores the hypersexualization of young black girls and the harmful effects of respectability politics. The author argues that respectability politics are not just about clothes or speech. They're about governing how young black women engage with their own sexuality as it is developing. She recounts her experiences with being labeled a fast-tailed girl and the ways in which this label offered no protection from sexism, racism, and other violence. Kendall shares personal anecdotes about growing up with traditional, sometimes misogynistic, male figures, like her grandfather, and shows how navigating patriarchal norms is complicated when it comes to the men who raised her and the man she loves. She also addresses the complex nature of patriarchal influences on marginalized communities and the need for feminists to have a more realistic understanding of these dynamics. Kendall argues that though such culture can be incredibly toxic, particularly where the demand for respect is enforced by the use of emotional and physical violence, in many ways it is simply the inverted image of iconic values. A push for equality, if not equity, are seen through a funhouse mirror. Kendall critiques the ways black women are often portrayed in media and literature. She challenges the use of stereotypes and the erasure of black women's humanity, and calls for a more nuanced and respectful representation. She suggests that propriety has become a governing philosophy in media, the workplace, and the academy, especially for black women as they age. She adds that it is a societal expectation that centers on managing the behavior of black people, largely black women, who have otherwise been neglected in a society that only wants to offer opportunity to those who have been approved by gatekeepers. Kendall discusses colorism and the ways in which beauty aesthetics incite her community are not the only place where she feels alienated. She shares personal experiences with colorism, texturism, and the pressures to conform to white-centric beauty standards, and emphasizes the importance of challenging these harmful norms. The book challenges the stereotype that eating disorders primarily affect white women. Kendall shares her own struggles with an eating disorder and discusses the ways in which racism, poverty, and lack of access to resources contribute to mental health issues in marginalized communities. She emphasizes that eating disorders are rarely even about food. They're more likely to be about other issues in the home or around it. Kendall examines the ways in which Black women are often fetishized for their strength and resilience, while their vulnerability and need for support are ignored. The author argues that as much as she is labeled as fiercely feminist, some of the strongest examples of successful and fierce Black women are Serena Williams and Beyoncé. The book challenges the stereotype that communities don't value education. Kendall shares her own experiences growing up in the South Side of Chicago, dispelling the myth that the hood punishes those who reach for success. To this end, a myth is perpetuated that the hood punishes you for being smart, that it hates those who reach for success. That wasn't her experience at all. The same kids who called her books are now adults who pass her articles around and tell her how proud of her they are, because there was nothing malicious in the teasing. Kendall addresses the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and other women of color, highlighting the lack of media attention and law enforcement resources devoted to these cases. She says that just like in any abusive relationship, the violence starts with manipulation, coercion, and propaganda. She adds that rape has been used to repress, to undermine, and to control because power functions in the same awful ways in every generation. The book explores the ways in which fear, particularly the fears of white women, can undermine feminist solidarity and perpetuate racist and oppressive systems. She references instances where women seem to act and vote against their own interests, and she poses the question: if feminism is failing them by being so focused on whether middle-class white women have what they need and want, but not on protecting voting rights for everyone else. Kendall explores the intersection of race, poverty, and politics, and the ways in which these factors contribute to the disenfranchisement of marginalized communities. She argues that what is most damning is how many white women who had benefited from the advances of feminism and affirmative action rushed to help undermine the same policies that gave them power and freedom. Kendall reflects on the effect schooling and educational institutions can have on young Black girls and boys, and she argues that harsh school policies in the wake of desegregation and safety practices that include bringing law enforcement into schools have combined to create the school-to-prison pipeline, in which troubled students are subject not just to detention, but to suspensions, expulsion, and even in-school arrests. Kendall talks about the other tent peg of poverty, the housing crisis. She claims that rising housing costs and lower wages are pushing marginalized women further and further away from stable housing and from personal safety. Budgeting about 30% of your monthly income for rent or mortgage costs, as the prevailing wisdom dictates, sounds reasonable until you compare the housing you can afford for 30% of a minimum wage salary with the housing available at that rate. Kendall touches on her own experience with the public discourse of her journey with maternal mortality. The placental abruption that her doctor had listed as a possibility was happening, and she was going to have to do her best to take care of both of us. When the story became public, she shares that a barrage of opinions followed about what she should have done. She would like to be able to say that she felt supported by feminists, but it wasn't her experience. Kendall reflects on the balancing act that parenting can be in the hood. In a country with a massive wealth gap that is directly tied to race, what does it mean to frame good parenting as making choices that are only accessible for those with excess income? What does it mean to assume that to be poor and not white means you are less capable of being a good parent? Especially when you factor in the power that white women can have over women of color and their children. Kendall concludes that allies, on paper, can sound great, but they do little to nothing to protect people in the hood. When a person has come to these spaces looking to take things away for their benefit instead of looking to contribute, then they're already doing it wrong. This is a space where we must be able to have the hard conversations after conflict, because sometimes the political is personal. Here are some of the most impactful lessons from hood feminism. An intersectional approach to feminism requires understanding that too often mainstream feminism ignores that Black women and other women of color are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of hate. Food insecurity, access to quality education, safe neighborhoods, a living wage, and medical care are all feminist issues. Solidarity is not for everyone. It cannot realistically include everyone, so perhaps the answer is to establish common goals and work in partnerships. Respectability has not saved women of color from racism. It won't save any woman from sexism or outright misogyny. These takeaways offer actionable insights for creating a more inclusive and effective feminist movement. This book serves as an insightful roadmap for a more inclusive and effective feminism, urging readers to challenge conventional assumptions, amplify marginalized voices, and actively dismantle oppressive systems. It reminds us that true solidarity requires continuous self-reflection, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and a commitment to creating a movement that genuinely serves all women, regardless of their race, class, or background. We invite you to explore hood feminism and engage with Mikki Kendall's call to action. This is more than a book. It's an invitation to reshape feminism into a force for comprehensive and meaningful change. Thanks for watching. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next book dive.